Afternoon, everybody. Welcome and thank you for joining myself and Connor and Deirdre at Belfast Exposed. It's a pleasure for me to get the opportunity to talk about this work. And firstly, this is the first time I've ever shown 4 bodies of work which are interacting or interconnecting together. So this is a first for me and a first for anybody who's looking in. I normally talk about mother and uncle. I talk a little bit about wife, but I've never done them all together. So hopefully let's see how this goes. Just before I start, no doubt you're admiring this wonderful self-portrait of me when I obviously did have hair back in the day when I was a second-year degree student at Derby studying photography. I look back at this obviously longingly now. But what I would like to say before, on 1 or 2 images, I do touch upon notions of death in relation to family. So I'd just like to pre-warn anybody about that. Not that there's anything within the images themselves, but it is something I talk about. So, okay, let's get started. So I've been making long durational bodies of work since 1987, basically since I started photography. When I was 16 years old. My family are not creative in any way. I went to the usual schools. I didn't do very well. I went to very strong Catholic schools. It was all priests and nuns, and I can talk about that, which I won't, because I'm still scarred from daily confession, which we were forced to go to. But the notion of school for me was this very rigorous, restrictive system. So the idea that I could do photography, go to college, and actually not be forced to be in a room, to be out on a daily basis talking about things that I was interested in, was an incredibly cathartic experience. And it was an experience which has stayed with me, and it's something I continue to do to this day. But I quickly decided I didn't want to be a commercial photographer, which I'll talk a little bit as we go along, partly due to the fact that nobody wanted me, either as a commercial photographer. So maybe I didn't really have much of a say in the type of photographer I wanted to be, but I was always interested in durational work. I started off initially, like lots of photographers, on the street. In the mid-80s, I was looking at a lot of American street photographers, people like Lee Friedlander, Gary Winogrand, people who'd been on road trips like Robert Frank with his famous body of work, The Americans. And I was looking at British documentary photographers, people like Martin Parr, Graham Smith, Chris Killip in particular. And I wasn't really aware of any other type of work other than that types of work. That idea that this external bodies of work driven by an interest in capturing something specific to the photographer. With Chris Killip, it was in flagrante and the documentation of the people and places in the northeast of England, and invariably heavy industry. With the Americans like Lee Friedlander and Gary Winogrand, it was this phrase that Lee Friedlander coined, social landscaping. So the idea of the landscape, but within the city built up urban environment, was really of interest to me. And certainly for the first few years, that became something that I was interested in, being a street photographer. But I was also working with domestic settings, and that's what I'm going to show to you today. So I'm going to flip it around a bit and start off with a body of work which is I'm still making to this day. It says we're going to start this. And we start off with wife. And there's something about these. I've been thinking about this style of photography, and it really comes from my interest in photo albums, because photo albums are certainly, they used to be really specific things. And I guess mine is no different to all the other albums. It's certainly no different to all the albums that I've seen. They form very similar characteristic tropes. They're always chronological. They always start off with you as a baby, and they always include, or only include, images which are supposed to be included, which are accepted within society of a specific event. So whether it be a christening, whether it be a birthday, a holiday, these events where we gather together, family members gather together. And that always interested me. And it interested me in the fact that they always stop. Mine stopped when I was 15. No real reason why it stopped. It was an end point. And everybody else's seemed to stop. And nowadays, these are less and less familiar with the fact that people don't physically make prints. They don't put images into what was a photo album, you know. And there wasn't the singular person who looked after them, which there was in my day. You know, it was always my mother would have this, and this was something that was passed on to me. But these days we work differently. But this had a massive impact on what I wanted to photograph in terms of, I enjoyed the idea of the domestic, these events which were deemed appropriate to photograph. But I wanted to do something different to that. And I questioned why we should only photograph ourselves on birthdays, wearing our best attire, or a christening, or those types of things, or for me a confirmation. These types of events which were deemed acceptable. So I just wanted to make work which was exactly the opposite, but was grounded in the people that we are familiar with, but not in the specific events. I wanted the absolute opposite to the specific events. I wanted the everyday. So for 31 years now, I've been documenting family and friends pretty much obsessively, daily, over this period. And it's about the not special event. It's the absolute opposite. And why, for me, when I started, and we started in 2006, was about this unfamiliarity with this person at this moment in time, and trying to get to know this person and trying to win their confidence about being photographed, even though Martina had seen a lot of the images I'd made of previously my mother and my uncle, and continuing to make. But it was about trying to win someone over. And it was the first time also that I was making work continually of somebody who wasn't within my immediate family, who wasn't a blood relative. So that in itself started to do something differently. So I photographed differently, in the fact that this unfamiliarity, and then this sense of relationship, was that I didn't expose the person. And what I mean by expose them is that they weren't confronted. We weren't visually aware of them. So there's something hidden. So, Martina often would hide in shadows, hide in reflection, hide by just moving her face to one side. So that interested me in relation to some of the work I'll show you in a little while, which I will concentrate more on. But one of the things that I've been interested in photography from basically the start is the formal qualities of picture making and modernism. And this really stems from the American Lee Friedlander, who was a master, still is a master, at controlling the actual, what we get in the image itself. So I wasn't so much interested, not initially anyway, I wasn't so much interested in what the image could talk about externally, but I was very much interested in the four corners and what we included within the picture itself. And first and foremost, and still to this day, I believe that you have to have a strong visual element within a photograph to draw people in. I'm a big believer that photography needs content and it needs light. And together you create something special. So I was making this work, and I'd been making photographs at this point for quite a long time, 20 odd years. Again, it was about photographing somebody, but it was the opposite to the work I'll show you later on Mother and Uncle, which is far more domestic. This was about a younger person, so it was about photographing notions of possibility. That someone who's younger, somebody who's living in the now, their world is encapsulated by what they can do. Now, obviously, we've all had a different experience in the last year with COVID. So maybe when we look at the work later, he will maybe start to think about what it's like to be kind of spending more time internally. But this body of work was intended to show a universality of a younger person with the options that we have, or many people have now. But again, it was the everyday, and it's about making images of the everyday, even if they're slightly absurd, or the fact that the person doesn't want to be photographed. So, it's almost becomes quite ritualistic. And my mother would always say, and I know Martina would say, is it over now? Have you finished? They say this idea that, come on, get on with it. It's almost like a chore. But for me, it's about this visual interpretation. And one of the other things that I'm interested in photography is viewpoint, in the fact that I am not so much just a spectator looking at, but I'm physically about there. So it's all the photographs are almost are taken from a conversational distance. So they're nearly all 3/4, because I want to be, it's like I am engaging with that person because they are family members. So I want to be very much present in the photographs, compared to a lot of photography where it's, you know, either very, very close up, or the first image was close up, or they're very far away. So it's these routines, these daily routines, just photographing, photographing, photographing all the time. And all this work is on film. Not that I think it makes any difference whatsoever, but it started in the 80s, and I make all my own prints and process. Very laborious these days. I should maybe move to digital. I don't know. But I also like the quirky elements of photography. So, you know, here's my wife, as everybody has at home, an S-21 Soviet MiG fighter pilot's outfit, you know, as you do. I did try it on, but it's incredibly hot and cramped, and I couldn't actually get the helmet over my head. But, you know, just one of these things. This is in Prague, and but the fact that, you know, someone's just got this full outfit from communist Russia, of Soviet Union, back in the day, you know, it just makes, you know, really interesting. It elevates this notion of a snap, because a lot of these are just snaps, and you know, I use that term not in the negative at all. But it's also about having that camera with you all the time, which, you know, for 20 odd years, you know, you have to physically decide, I'm taking a camera with me. Nowadays, we have access to that type of material. You know, we all have the phone with us. It's something you know, you take your wallet, you have your phone. So you have access to making images. But this idea of recording for me was always, you know, I always had to feel I had to have a camera with me. I just want to, you know, again, light subject matter. I was too being a northerner in England. I was too cheap to hire a wedding photographer. So I thought, well, I thought I could do a better job myself. So this is obviously one I took, and I took a lot of photographs, you know, at the wedding. So again, it's just being there, photographing. But again, it's following my interest in a lot of photographers, the American photographers, so people like Friedlander, again, who was really interested in flattening perspectives. You know, a lot of his work had a cubist feel about it, whether it be American monuments. So he used things like windows, reflections to flatten perspective. And again, that's something I was influenced with. So even though I wasn't making directly photographs on the street, if there is an involvement on the street, or I do use these as photographic devices within my work. I also tend not to show the work chronologically, although there is one body of work here which I will show chronologically, which I'm not quite convinced about yet, but we'll see. I'll be interested to know whether you think it's working or not. I mean, this interests me, this photograph, because actually, I mean, I'm very behind with my film processing, because I take a lot of photographs. I actually processed this film about 6 months ago in the first lockdown. So it's only 10 years out of 10 years since I took the photograph, which obviously is not probably the best working, you know, methodology, sorry, where, you know, you're waiting 10 years before you actually have a look at the photograph. But it just kind of fascinated me in relation to that, you know, working with digital machinery where it's absolutely instant. The idea that I took this photograph in 2010 and then just developed it like 6 months ago, just kind of really found quite interesting. And the other thing I photograph is like not to miss anything as well. And this is my wife pregnant, and I just document, you know, you're having a moment, discomfort, but again, obviously the mascara rung in. Just photograph. And if anybody's interested in kind of making documents of like this, or of people who they're close to, the more you do it, they become less resistant to you on the whole. I mean, it's maybe it's like a war of nutrition. You know, you wear somebody down, and I just photograph to the point where that's what you do, you know, and it becomes very much a part of the relationship, for good and bad. And, you know, again, you get pregnant, and I remember one of the nurses saying they don't call it labor for nothing. It's really bloody painful. And I mean, I was just like a classic husband, a classic man, really pathetic. You know, I would go in the morning, I'd go into the town centre and go to the Costa Coffee and buy coffee and far too many croissants and pastries and bring them to Martina, who obviously didn't want them. But I felt completely and utterly useless. You know, you can see the anguish and pain on somebody, but you're in no position to do anything. But I still take the photographs. I mean, there is that moral implications of making photographs, which less so about this work, but there are other bodies of work, which I'll talk about that more. And then something happens when you have a child. You know, your life changes, your relationship specifically changes as well, because no longer are you carefree, no longer is it just you two together, and no longer can you just decide, let's do something tonight. Something changes very quickly, immediately. And then I started to document what came next, which was my son. And it was a big shock having children, and the implications of actually having to be less selfish in a way. And because being a photographer is incredibly selfish, and I'd always done everything myself, and all of a sudden I had to, somebody else was reliant on me, and I don't think I was very successful at that at the start, and maybe not to this day, I don't know. But it's something you know you have to do. But again, I was photographing all the time, and I was interested in this at this moment, interested in this notion of anguish, this difficulty, this idea of birth being painful and hard work, and that's what I wanted to kind of show within the work at this time. So again, it's just that snapshot at that moment in time. And I think I did about, well, I don't think, I know I did about, I did 50 rolls of film for the first, I think the first week, you know, just camera, photographing. I mean, everything. And then the idea with this, like any film photography, it's the notion of not so much what you take, but it's how you edit. You know, what do you decide to show, which becomes the interesting part. And again, just following formal picture making ideas. Anybody, I mean, this famous photograph, if anybody, on the image on the TV, if anybody knows who it is, I'll give you a second or two. It's by a photographer called John Claridge, and it's was Tommy Cooper. But again, I just like this contrast, you know, this menacing eyes, these graphic eyes looking down, or actually looking at us, the viewer. And here we have the child again looking at us, but again, completely just, you know, incapable of looking after themselves. So, you know, again, this juxtaposition, these formal picture making elements kind of really interest me. And just to let you know, if anybody's interested in photographing TV screens, a 15th of a second is the only shutter speed you can use where you don't get the wave lines. 8 for a 30th, you won't get a complete image. So I didn't read about that. I ended up taking thousands and thousands of photographs of screens, and TV screens are something that really interests me. So again, and then for me, it was about this relationship where we have this small child who's not independent, so he's still dependent. So I had to document that. And then for me, these are probably the closest to a family album pictures, because here I am, the father figure with the camera who's never seen in the images, like all the family albums. So there is kind of that little crossover amongst my work where I do feel these are almost befitting a family album. But the other issue, I mean, the thing with photographing children is that they're not in a position to say, well, actually, I don't want you to do that. And that for me was a really big problem. And it's only this probably the first time I've actually shown the work, although I do put 1 or 2 images up now very recently on social media, but I'm really guarded about it. So initially when I photographed my son, I decided I'd only photograph him if he was crying, because I thought I didn't want something which was so nice. But then I thought, well, actually, that's really wrong. I shouldn't be doing that. So, you know, I did pick him up after this, after a few seconds. But, you know, bad dad. But again, I'm still not so sure. I think this is the least most successful body of work so far, because I think children, I think they're great when they're babies because you position them as something unique. But then they reach these ages here, you know, from say 4 to where he's at now, 9, and it's just, I think I need another 10 years with him before it becomes interesting. As much as I like the pictures, and you know, you obviously we all like pictures of our own children, you know, but whether they mean anything to other people, I'm not sure yet. So I think out of all of them, these are imbued with the least amount of. There's less metaphor in these images. Although some of them, I just they make me smile. And with these, like in anything modern, I mean, I do cheat here. I do. This is a phone photograph. I can't believe I'm even saying it, but cat out of the bag. But I don't mind when I say. I mean, there's obviously a history now of photographers photographing the children. Christopher Anderson did Son. He's just done Pia of his documentation of his daughter, which is on a mixture of cameras. And you can now. I mean, the quality's there. So why not? You know, as long as you're taking pictures, really. Back to film. I want to do a whole series just of him in his life, just Xboxing or PlayStation or Nintendo. So I'm not very good with those things. But this idea that they're completely engrossed and they're completely unaware of you, even when you're talking at them, they're just not listening to you. It's something that kind of interests me as well. This kind of absorption into a space. He still has to do his chores and get used to it, which is something I never did, which I'll talk about a bit later as well. This is, I very rarely do commercial work. This is one of, I was just, some very recent commercial work. So it's really nice that I've been able to incorporate actually my son into making commercial work. So even though it's an editorial, people still hire me to actually just do what I do, which is in many ways the best of both worlds. He wouldn't normally be wearing a legitimate Dolce & Gabbana top at a hideous amount of money. But so you just photograph in the same style, even though it was a commission. So the two long-standing bodies of work I've been doing since 1987 as Uncle and Mother, and these are the work that kind of really got me onto this. But it wasn't until 1992 that I really kind of saw it as anything other than just snaps. In 92, about 91, 92, a few things happened. I started studying photography at degree at Derby, which was an incredible place to study. But we were fortunate that Nan Goldin was there for a short period of time. And so to see Nan Goldin with cigarette in hand, like an M6, and just shooting, and obviously being introduced to the ballad of sexual dependency, even though it'd been out a few years, it was the first time I'd really come across it, and I'd never seen anything like it. It was carefree. It wasn't technically biased. Some of the images were blurred, but that didn't matter. The presentation with the sound, the personal usage of music, which meant something, was incredibly uplifting. And also at the same time, I went to, I say same time, a month later, say, I went to the bookshop at Derby at the university, and I had some lovely books, and I bought 2 books. I bought a catalogue, Pleasures and Terrors of Domestic Comfort, which was an exhibition which was curated by Peter Galassi at MoMA in New York, and it was basically a who's who of people who'd worked within domestic settings. And the other photographer who's with profound effect was Sally Mann's immediate family. I'd never seen images of that quality or shocking of children. And it just kind of all of a sudden, it was, although they were complex, it kind of opened me up to other photographers. I started to look at the notion of the domestic as a legitimate way to photograph. So then other photographers like Nicholas Nixon, his chronology of his wife and sisters in the Brown Sisters, Emmett Gowan, another incredible American photographer who documented family members, and in particular his wife Edith. Just all of a sudden, it meant I could do this legitimately. So I just So I started photographing, and again, I would have two cameras. I used Leicas, and I just had cameras with me all the time. And every time I used to go back and visit my mother, I would have, get my washing done, take some beans with me, eat properly, vegetables, what are they when you're a student, and just photograph and just photograph and photograph and photograph, and not be precious about it, and try and just photograph the things, something about older people. And I'm starting to do this myself, which is worrying me, starting to look out of the window waiting for people who might come, but you end up looking about half an hour too early and you stay looking there. So I was interested in documenting all these daily rituals, the little things which are really, really banal, because the reality is the majority of our time is doing very little. I dread to think how much time I've been watching recently, watching Netflix and all these things which, you don't really doing anything. But the other things like I talked about in terms of reflection, so windows became really important to me, and mirrors, and this notion of inside and outside in photographing spaces. And also the notion of taste. What makes someone decide to decorate a house, which if you live in a semi-house, there's an exact opposite in terms of, in terms of the building next door, but they decorate it really differently. So this notion of taste became interesting to me. I think you're lucky that these were in black and white, because when I talk about taste, this was the 80s. The carpet was kind of bluey pink. That was a pinky red sofa. The curtains were blue with pink and yellow. It was horrific. I mean, if this was colour now, you'd need sunglasses. So maybe I should have done it in colour. I don't know. But again, just this every day. So I documented for years and years and years, just every time I went back, photograph, photograph, photograph. I said these aren't in chronological order, but it's just like these spaces remain the same, the people remain the same. But what makes them interesting is that we see them aging. But as I say, I don't do them chronologically. It doesn't seem to work for me. So my uncle only had one job a year to do, which was to clean the windows on Christmas Day before the other family members come. That's all he would ever, it's the only thing he could do. But there's other photographs where you can just see the streaks where he failed miserably. And it was a really, very traditional. So my mother and her brother lived together for 76 years of their lives, neither married. But it was very much like a marriage in the fact that my uncle would go out as a man, go out and make the money. My mother would deal and cook the food, do the house cleaning, do the tidying up. We were pretty pathetic, me and my uncle, actually, incredibly lazy. You talk about regrets. I wish we'd have done a lot more, actually, for my mother, who worked very hard for us. So my mother had been up since 6 o'clock getting things ready. But with my uncle, unlike the mother work, I wanted it to be a little bit more surreal, a little bit more shadowy, partly because my relationship was different to that with my mother, and also he used to laugh a lot. So it used to be really, really frustrating to get him to photograph, for me to photograph him without him laughing a lot. So a lot of the time I do use kind of mirrors, reflections, shadows, because otherwise it was impossible. So for every good photograph where he's not laughing, there's another roll where he's just smiling innately at me, which annoyed me very much, which I think is partly why he did it. So I'm hoping I've put together a finished book of this. When I say finished, I've just sent it off to a publisher who's agreed to publish it. So we're just hoping that with COVID, that we may be able to get it published early next year. So, a lot of these photographs are taken from the viewpoint of me, actually how I existed. So it would be me. So where I'm sat there in the dining room table is my seat at the dining room table. Where I photograph a lot on the settees is from my position on that seat. So a lot of the images are just of me being physically there where I would be, just with a camera to my eye. And we can just see my mother's rubber gloves, marigolds in the top left. So it's kind of togetherness. There is another body of work which I've not shown anybody of them together over 20 odd years. This is my uncle taking a golf swing. I mean, he was far better at golf in the kitchen without a club in his hand than he was on the actual course, but he used to just do swings all the time. So in many ways, he lived like a king, not a great king, obviously, with 3 pieces of toast there. But you know, my mother would put this ready, and then she would call him, and he would come when he felt it was time, and just eat, and then leave the plate, and then my mother would clear it up and clean it, and this would happen all the time. But it's the little things. I mean, they had this chairs and tables for about 7 years, and not once did they take the polystyrene off the chairs. So when we actually finally binned them, they were polystyrene with the little sticker on, which was basically about saying, you know, these are not heat resistant or they're flammable or something like that, stayed on there. No idea why, as if we were expecting some special guests to come. So even at Christmas time, it would still remain with the polythene on the chairs. No idea why. But again, it's this notion of glass reflection, inside, outside. Like a lot of people, you know. So again, the more I look at these images, and the closer recently, as I've been getting closer to the ages of the people in the photograph, my mother and my uncle, I find myself doing the same thing. Now, if I'm cold, I go to a radiator to warm my hands. You know, I think it must be an age thing. And this is an image which I now resonate with. I see myself in this image. I look at the microwave and I can't see the dials enough, so I don't know if I'm defrosting or cooking anything, and invariably, and so there's some, you know, there's quirkiness within the work which I like, which is what we get, and you know, it's intentionally the absolute opposite of what, say, like Nick Waplington did with Living Room, or Richard Billingham with Raise a Laugh. You know, it wasn't. Even though I grew up on a council estate in Leeds, and you know, but it was a very easy family life, you know. And that's what I'm interested in documenting, what I know. I wasn't trying to document something that I didn't know or trying to change it into something that was unfamiliar. It's the familiarity that interests me. You know, and also the little things, why you've got a roll of kitchen foil in your bedroom. You know. I think what happens also, I mean, what interests me about this type of work and relationships in general, what because of the familiar, you don't notice things. I started showing the work, and when I say I started showing my work, I didn't show anybody my work realistically for over 20 years. I think it was about 24 years before I decided to show something. And in 2014, I had a conversation with my mother and said, how would she feel if I started to try and show the work? Not that I knew if anybody would be interested. So I went to Houston in Texas for Photo Fest, the biggest festival where you show your work to professionals, and I started showing it to uncle and mother. And then I got a phone call from my mother, and my mother never called me. And she said, look, don't worry, but your uncle's been taken to hospital, but he's fine. He needs a valve replacement in his heart, absolutely fine. So fine. Anyway, I came back and it wasn't fine, and you know, we're told, you know, whatever reason, it basically wasn't going to happen. So I had to make arrangements for him to come. He wanted to come home to die, so I made those arrangements for that to happen. So again, this idea of, you know, the moral implications of documenting photographing, what you photograph, what you don't photograph, what you should or shouldn't do. So they brought this material over to photograph him on the bed, which would obviously where he would end up, and it just reminded me of coffin. It had this slatted satin insides, which just looked like what a coffin would have, which I was horrified, but there's nothing you can do. And this is the last photograph I took of my uncle, and because I don't work commercially, I could always re-photograph. If my uncle was smiling too much in one day, I could photograph him the next day. So this was the only time I could never re-photograph him. I knew that I would never have another opportunity to photograph him. So I went a bit mad, and I lit him, I kind of set things up, and I made this image. But I didn't show anybody for a long time, and I had a conversation with a photographer about, you know, what if I should show it or not. And he said, absolutely, you should show it. It does continue the work, and you've earned the right to show this work. But, you know, I still live with the thinking about, would my uncle have wanted me to show this image? And that I don't know. This is the last image I ever took. Although I do like to remember him like this, but this isn't him with me, this is him with my son. But I kind of replaced my son with me in this photograph, because this is how I remember my uncle looking after me, my uncle taking me on holiday, my uncle walking with me, or me walking with my uncle. So for me, this is just a nice reminder of actually this man who I knew. The other body of work, which I worked on for a long time, and actually longer, in the same space, is Mother. Now, this image kind of haunts me a bit now, because if you actually take your hand and you just cover up the actual person, my mother, in the middle of the screen, and you just concentrate on the shadow on the left, it's horrifyingly, sorry, my phone's gone off, it horrifyingly reminds me of the spitting image character, Margaret Thatcher, which absolutely frightens the hell out of me, but I just can't think of anything other than Margaret Thatcher when I look at this image now. Anyway, for those of you who are holding a for spitting image, anyway, but I understand it's coming back, but it won't have Thatcher in. So this is like the introduction. This is the front door. Hi, welcome. And we've got these flowers, like that. So my mother, again, I wanted to document my mother about every day and photograph the visual elements around her, which was very much marigold gloves, whether they be yellow, pink, blue. Always wore marigold gloves for pretty much everything. And again, it's just this documentation. What do you do? But the thing with my mother is, and you know, at this point, I knew the work of people like Sally Mann, and this notion of what you could photograph or what you couldn't photograph became important. So my mother allowed me to photograph her anywhere around the house, the garden, and I used to photograph her all the time in pubs and bars and going out, but except her bedroom. Her bedroom was her space, and obviously no nudity, because that's not what we did. I mean, if we did, then it'd be photographed like that. But her space, you know, that her bedroom was her space. But my mother liked to smoke. She smoked more menthols, because apparently they weren't as strong. But I have been reading that they're more addictive than normal cigarettes, so the irony. And a nice gin and tonic. So she'd always have a gin and tonic after work, and a few menthol more cigarettes. They're quite long as well, so they looked really elegant. And cigarettes are great to photograph, aren't they? I love cigarettes. And just going out, getting ready to go out, you know, but again, just sort of done a hair up, got makeup on, earrings, bag over the shoulder. But I was really disappointed when my mother stopped smoking about 15 years ago, because obviously it was great. I just love smoke and photography, but obviously not good for your health. And I like to document. What I like about this type of slow work is that you get, I mean, for me, it's about how many interesting photographs can I take in the same space. You know, so even I've got thousands of photographs of my mother over a 30-year period in that space, this nook within the kitchen, which was her space. I mean, the one thing I will say, you'll virtually see I think there was no photographs of my uncle in the kitchen, which tells you a lot. So again, this formal picture making images, you know, my mother on the left, me in the, you know, the joke about the bun in the oven, me with the angel wings, even though it's just a clothes line, washing line behind me in the oven, my reflection. But again, these are all the same spaces, but just, you know, you can make different images. We never changed the kitchen ever. I mean, it was falling apart in the end. It's quite amazing. And obviously, you start to see a different age progression. I think my uncle washed up 4 times in all the time he lived in the house. I think I may have washed up 3 times. Actually, I did a lot more later on. But it's testament to one, how much my mother did. Terrible, really, for both me and my uncle. That's one of my regrets in life. We didn't do more about the house. But my mother was a great one for lists. I don't know if this is a generational thing, but she would write down everything she would spend, everything she owed to anyone. So if she'd been out with a sister and the sister had bought one gin and tonic more than my mother would have write it down so she knew exactly how much she would owe her sister next time she saw her. I mean, to the half penny. I mean, lists after lists after lists, and everything she ever bought would be itemized on a list. So she was very acutely aware of money because my mother didn't have a lot. And some images kind of imbued more things than others. I mean, one of the things that you don't see is my father. This is my mother getting ready to go out, pre-telephones, pre-mobile phones. So basically, if you arrange to meet up with someone the following week, you just get ready and hope they may turn up. My father was notorious for not turning up, and this was one of those occasions. So my mother getting ready, and then my father don't turn up. So how long do you wait? At which point my mother goes back up to her bedroom, gets changed from her going out clothes, takes off her makeup, and then comes back down where her brother and child are sat watching a Burt Reynolds film or something like that, or sport, invariably sport. You know, that notion of that silence, that nothing is ever said because no one wants to question the fact that, you know, she's been stood up. The other thing with this photograph is it wasn't too long after that I came home and my mother was smoking heavier than usual, a big ashtray full of cigarette ends and quite a few gin and tonics. And she said she's got something to tell me. And my father was very, very ill at this point and dying. And it wasn't so long after this photograph that my father died. And so my mother told me, well, it's going to be pretty complex for the funeral. So I said, don't worry, we'll deal with it anyway. So on the day of the funeral, I found out that I was introduced to all these people, all these men who were older than me, women who were older than me, and these were all my half brothers and half sisters. And what I hadn't known is that my father was a bigamist, and he was married to 4 women at the same time in Leeds. I don't know if you can be a serial bigamist, but he was. But he never married my mother, so that was obviously problematic. But my mother was very upset. She'd fallen in love with the wrong person. And after the night of the funeral, I basically went out with all these new half brothers and half sisters and got absolutely smashed. But during the night, we all had our family albums with us, our photo albums, and we all shared each other's family albums. And they were all identical because they all had their mother in, they all had our father in with his car, and he'd photographed everybody in the same place. So we'd all be photographed out in Scarborough or Blackpool behind this chip shop. And except we'd all been eradicated from each other's lives and been imprinted in. It was a really, really strange experience. But what I also found out is that everybody knew everybody. So my uncle, my aunties would all know all these people. So they would all go drinking at the same time. And me being the youngest, was kept completely away from this. So it was a deeply strange experience. And it also kind of discussed about, I mean, I never knew why I was born in Manchester when I grew up in Leeds, and no one ever told me anything. I was none the wiser. It didn't bother me, other than I used to get teased at school that I could never play for Yorkshire cricket because unless you were born in Yorkshire, you couldn't play back in the day. But my mother went to basically being an Irish Catholic, pregnant out of wedlock was complete no-no. I mean, absolute no-no. The church controlled everything. The priest would come once a week to the house. I was at school. I was going to confession every day. You'd be making up lies about what you were confessing to your confessor. It was lunacy. But so basically, my mother went to have me aborted, and Manchester in 1971 was the only place that had an abortion clinic. But her brother went after her and said, look, we'll sort it out. We'll hide it from the church. We'll do this, we'll do that. So I spent quite a long time in Manchester until her brother had kind of figured a plan of action to bring me back, and his sister. So images, imbued certain things, but again, TV screen. But one of the other things is I never spoke to my mother after the funeral. I vowed I would never talk about it. I never talked about my father. We never talked. Very rarely did we talk about feelings. We weren't a particularly touchy-feely family. But I did make that decision then back in the early 90s. I would actually look after my mother. So this is why excuse me, I nearly always break up here at this point. But I think this is one of the reasons why I continued making this work. And I think it became really important for us because it was a means that we both needed one another. And photography gave us an ability to not actually ask any difficult questions, but it allowed us to be with each other. This is my mother going through a Coronation Street phase, Deirdre Roberts. Deirdre, is it Deirdre? Deirdre phase, I can't remember what her surname is in Coronation Street, but those glasses, upside down glasses almost. So again, it sees daily routines, folding sheets, wearing marigolds. Again, me having a cup of tea, my mother in the other room. But my mother would, as I say, I mean, it wasn't until later that we realised my mother probably had some various issues. I mean, she wouldn't open doors even anywhere without tissue paper. You know, even if she was serving broccoli, she'd serve broccoli with the marigolds on. You know, she'd happily watch TV all night with marigolds on, and certainly answer the phone with marigolds on. It was just something which was regular. We didn't see it as strange at all. And the idea of defrosting the turkey on Christmas morning, you know, should have been done days before. This idea of, you know, people changing. So again, this idea of reflections, and really interesting that the person reflected actually doesn't look like my mother. It looks someone who's like 20 years younger, but obviously it is my mother. This pub, the pub was great because you could get burgled in the morning, which happened quite often. Kids used to just smash the door in with giant stones and then nick everything. And then if you went to the pub in the afternoon, you could buy all your stuff back off, you know, and get the insurance sorted. So it was a rough pub, but a big estate pub. So as I said earlier, they lived together as brother and sister for 76 years of their lives until her brother died in 2014. This is the same space. I think there's 21 years difference between these photographs. Ooh, sorry, we've got something's gone wrong there. Just bear with me a second. Let's see if we can get that up again. Yeah, back. Okay, yeah, okay. So cool. And then it's just the same space. This idea of photographing somebody in the same space but at different time periods, you just get an idea of obviously time periods. This is 2014, I think 21st of May. This is the morning of her brother's funeral. So obviously difficult but photographing. My mother was very familiar with this persona. You know, this is a routine we had. I photographed. It was obviously an upsetting day for everybody, but you know, here she comes down from her bedroom in these Hollywood kind of Grace Kelly style glasses. You know, because obviously she should have been crying. I didn't want people to see that, or puffy eyes. But it was obvious the house was too large, and it was obvious just how much money her brother had and how much she didn't. So we had to sell the house. And this is the last. This is the last portrait I took of my mother in the home. You see in the background the space where obviously the frames have gone and it's changed the light. Also, the table would have been there. So this is the only time I've actually been able to get this type of shot in that space because there's no longer a table there. But this is so not only is it the last portrait I took of my mother in the home, it's the last collaborative portrait I ever took of my mother. What I mean by that is the last time my mother could say, yes, you can photograph me, or no, or I would say, can you go a bit left, can you go a bit right? After this, she moved in with a sister. We were going to buy my mother a flat next door, or actually below a sister who lived in Otley, just outside of Leeds. Anyway, she had an accident, she had a fall, and she was diagnosed with delirium, and things went downhill from there. But so this is, as I say, the last collaborative portrait. But I wanted to document the space, you know, the space where we'd lived, and then the quietness of this space. And this is the last picture that I made in the house, and the Henry Hoover, Professor Elizabeth Edwards, who's a wonderful kind of academic on photography, and she's a bit like a detective, really. She talks about pictures and she sees the clues, and she wrote about how the Henry Hoover, when looking at us, it's basically hoovering away the existence of a life or anything, and it just kind of interested me. It's also the only, and basically when it was obvious that my mother didn't need the flat when she was suffering and she was in a care home, it was obvious that, you know, we could get rid of everything. So the only thing we kept once we got rid of everything was the Henry Hoover. And it was probably about 2 years after we'd moved, I'd not been in this house, I took the Henry Hoover home, and but it was full, so I had to empty. And I think, but what was interesting I emptied it was full of all the dust from the house. So the dust just smelled of the house. It was so evocative. It brought more back to me, more memories of my family and existing than any photograph could ever. It was amazing. So I kept a little Ilford HP5 cassette, and I put some dust in. And if I ever now want a hit of remembering, I just, a bit like snuff without putting it up my nose, I just have an intake or inhale, and it's quite very evocative. But as I say, my mother fell. She was diagnosed with delirium. She didn't come out of it, and then she was finally diagnosed with mixed dementia. And then it was an awful, for 3 years, a horrible experience, really. And again, these implications of, do you photograph them? You know, my mother had given me her consent by modeling for me, by being accepted to be photographed. This she hadn't. Would my mother want to be seen like this? Probably, not probably, definitely not. I'm glad it's not in the book, it's not in Mother, partly because we wanted to keep it within the family home, not within the nursing home. And also, you know, photographers talk about things being raw. What they tend to mean is that somebody who would be not particularly happy about a photograph. My mother's sister, youngest sister, was alive and looking after her, and I don't think my youngest, Christine, would have wanted this image in the book. So I show it now, and I talk about the work, but I talk about it in relation to dementia and the cruelty of the disease. I don't necessarily equate this image as about being my mother, because it's not my mother anymore. She didn't know who I was. She had no inclination. If my son would come round, if she was on a good day, she would see me in my son, not my son. And this is the last photograph I ever took of my mother. Okay, so thank you very much. Don't be shy. We all need likes and friends on Instagram, so please follow me, have a look, and again, have a look at my website. Okay, thank you very much. Shall I stop sharing?
Yep, please.
Okay. I don't know if anyone's still with us, if everybody's just left. You never know.
There's a few I think had to go on, which was fair enough, but thank you so much for that. That was wonderful, and you just brought so much of it to life. I do have a few questions for you, but like one observation, and I suppose you finished at that. You're very concerned about the ethics of photography, which is becoming more and more prevalent in society now. And to some degree, I think it censors the work a little, and it makes us more cautious of what we're doing, because I believe the role of an artist is also to be an observer in life. And one momentous thing I had seen, it was billed by Viola, and it was the birth of his daughter, his grandchild, and the death of his mother, and he played the two simultaneously, and both very private moments in one regard, but actually life affirming, or it gave it a reason, and the spiritualness that came with that was very profound and very powerful. And actually looking at those images that you have, I have to say I find them as emotive and profound and powerful. And maybe the question you need to be asking yourself potentially is, if it was your son who took up the role of photography and was socially documenting you, would you want him to take, would you want that photograph be shown? So, maybe the answer lies within.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I do think that photographers are getting more and more pushed by that notion. So it's just how you're going to continue on with that, because you have a passion within you that drives you to make those images. It's undoubtable. Um, so why not?
Oh no, I'll never stop. I mean, I already have my final image in my mind. If everything goes according to plan, I'll be in a bed, and I'll be on my final moments. I would like my son to photograph me.
Yeah. And I think Malcolm, who had to go on, has basically said the Tommy Cooper overlooking the baby was a great image, and he thinks the role of durational photography, like your own, can't be underestimated, the value that recording over time. And really what he was asking, do you intend to continue that family album?
Yeah. I don't stop. I mean, it's obsessional, isn't it? So I will never stop at all. It's something you're just going to continue with. You don't. It's not work or anything. It's something you do. It's I constantly have a camera with me, constantly making work and images, and then it's the editing process, which is the difficult part, and it's about what do you include, what do you exclude, and up until I find until it's a book form, then anything can change. So as I say, hopefully Uncle will be published, and then Wife, and then Son, but Son's got another 10 years before I realistically look at it.
Yeah.
But yeah.
And Terry Core, you have a few questions, Terry. Do you want to ask them yourself? On mute.
Yes, no, that's great. Thanks, Deirdre. I actually did have questions, but of course were written prior to listening to you and watching your work. And what kind of changed for me over the time from the questions I was going to ask to now was that there was a great warmth in the photographs. You could see that there was a lot of love in there, but it was when the empty house came in, suddenly it became very poignant, the whole thing, that those people weren't there anymore. And I just find that probably some of the strongest pieces that I've seen was when we actually came to the empty rooms, the empty kitchen, the Henry Hoover, and you suddenly thought, it's just been fantastic that you had the foresight, and probably just it was a natural thing, to photograph these people in the first place. Because when you get that right round that full circle thing, if there is such a thing as a full circle, that was the most poignant stuff for me when the rooms were empty. But I did have images, I did have questions which are probably, I didn't know whether it'd be too personal or not. But when I first came across you and what you said about your father, your mum being dressed up to go out, and suddenly you would be there and you'd notice that you'd come down probably in their comfortable clothes again. And I didn't know, I just thought to myself, that was probably something that triggered so many things for you, that you felt you had to maybe capture this person who wasn't in your life. So you maybe decided to capture other people. Is that a question, or is that okay to ask that?
You can ask anything. I mean, once I think you make the decision to kind of really personalize personal work, then everything's fair game. And, I find out different things from people asking me certain things, and finding observations in the work. I really like, I'm pleased you mentioned the final images, as it went quieter, which they're really poignant for me, and really good inclusions. I mean, it's a strange one. I mean, that one image. I mean, images are really interesting me because I do a lot of talks like this, so I have convinced myself that that specific image triggers certain my idea of my memory. But I'm so used to looking at the photograph and triggering that memory. I'd like to think it's 100% correct, but I reckon it's closer to about 95% correct now. I think, that timing about what we remember. I mean, there's some images I remember from 3 or 4 years ago, 5 years ago, I remember like yesterday. I mean, what I don't remember my mother as a younger person. So the photographs of my mother really young. When I say young, she was 50 when I started photographing her. Her brother was 59. Something like that, 50, something like that. Actually, she may have been late 40s, but I don't remember my mother that. Even though I was 17, even though I was photographing her, I mean, I only remember, say, the last 15 years. Same with her brother. And the problem I have with this type of work is that it can only ever be incomplete. I didn't know my mother before I was born, and I obviously visually didn't photograph them until I was 16 plus. I'll photograph my son up until a point I die. So you can never get, so as much as that's just the reality of it, and it will never stop me, but I do feel that it's always incomplete. But I mean, I really became interested in this work when I started watching, again, I was just on TV, Michael Apted, who did the series 7 Up, which followed these kids, 7, 14, 21, 28. And just that idea of the little moments in people's lives, making one decision which can have a massive bearing on then what happens next, just really, really fascinated me. So I just think that just allowed me gave me the motivation just to continue it, really.
Thanks very much. That's great work. I love it. That's fantastic.
No, thank you.
Michelle Maloney, you were wanting to ask a question?
Yeah, please. Hi. Hi. Absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much. Great presentation, Matthew. Obviously, by my accent, I'm Irish, and so I suppose the thing that really struck me was about the courage of your uncle. I suppose the story for me just holds so much love, but the courage of him to actually say, we'll find a way to sort this out about the baby. I mean, that didn't happen for most people, and I suppose I see it as a document of in ways kind of like the images. It's almost artifacts of love. I suppose that's the one thing I wanted to say. But I'm also interested in when you started off photographing your uncle and your mother, like how do they I mean, you were son and nephew, obviously. So how did they take you moving into the role of photographer? How was that, and how did you negotiate that with them? That's one part. And the other thing, I suppose, I wanted to make a comment about the real authenticity, but also was there a level of performative, I suppose, of performance with them as time went on around the images?
Yeah, I mean, neither knew. There was no artistic background in my family. There's nothing. I mean, knew nothing about the arts whatsoever. I mean, my uncle was incredibly supportive, so he would buy me. If I wanted a camera, he would buy me a camera, and he knew Leicas were the best, so he would buy me a Leica. If it had to be a Nikon, he'd buy me Nikons. I mean, I was incredibly fortunate. I mean, in many ways, up until he passed away, I didn't really know how expensive photography was, because he built me a darkroom, he paid paper, film, paid for everything. I mean, there's that level of support I could never pay back, nor would he have ever wanted me to. But absolutely, there was a level of performance, and later on, I mean, what I was getting at. So my mother, through being photographed all the time, started to become aware, which was her best side, quality of light, how close I could get, what I was doing, the fact that what she thought, what I was thinking and what she was thinking would be two different things in what would be physically seen in the photograph. So she became very aware of her own image and what my intentions were. So in her own words, she would say, if she wasn't happy with something, she'd just say bugger off, and that would be it. But there were very rarely any times where I couldn't photograph them, but I would show them at Christmas when family members come over, the sisters would come over, and generally I would get the confidence around about 11:30 after they'd drank a fair few. And they would be in howls of laughter. And the sister would be like, "Oh my God, you look a dog in this. Look at your ankles in this." So they weren't, I mean, I was trying to present these as serious
Yeah.
images,
Okay.
and their interests were less. They were just incredibly supportive. I mean, they never stopped supporting me. I mean, I do occasionally talk about how some family members just, give their children, money to buy a home or various things. I mean, my mother and my uncle, who is my father figure, who was the one who took me on holiday, who learned me how to swim. And I mean, my father was in jail. I mean, you can't marry 4 women, and he was in jail for a period of time. Was that they gave me their time, and they just they get, and that's incredibly priceless, really. So yeah, so I was very supportive and lucky. I think you're on mute there, Michelle.
Okay. No, that's great work. Thank you.
Is there any other questions? No. Well, on that note, I would just like to say, Matthew, that was absolutely wonderful on behalf of everyone here. And thank you so much. There's a lot of comments in there. People had to move on. So thank you for that.
No, you're very welcome. Thank you very much, and thank you everybody. It's
Thank you.
so it's, yeah. What else is anyone going to do on a Friday now?